The courtroom at the Fulton County Courthouse in Atlanta, Georgia, was bathed in dim light from the high windows. On March 12, 2025, the air was heavy, with the smell of coffee from the paper cups of journalists and the murmur of the crowd. The wooden benches were packed with people, reporters, locals, and a few tense faces from both sides. Laura Bennett sat at the defendant's table, her dark brown eyes shining with a sharp calm. She wore a white shirt and black slacks, her short curly hair pinned up, her posture erect, as if she were still in a military meeting. Laura was not the type to be easily subdued, but today, she sat still, observing everything with the focus of someone used to analyzing threats in the dark. Across from Laura was Officer Daniel Harris, a white man in his mid-30s with a chiseled face and a confident gaze. He wore a police uniform, his badge glinting in the light, but the way he curled his lips as he looked at Laura suggested arrogance. Harris had charged Laura with resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer during an arrest last December. His story, spread through local newspapers and social media, portrayed Laura as an aggressive woman who had caused trouble in a quiet neighborhood. Some believed him. Others, especially in Atlanta's Black community, suspected this was yet another abuse of power. Judge Evelyn Carter, a white woman in her mid-60s with short silver hair, entered the room. Her gavel rang out, signaling silence. State of Georgia versus Laura Bennett, the court clerk announced dryly. Laura stood, moving slowly but surely, her gaze locked on the judge. The crowd murmured softly, curious about the woman of color facing serious charges. Next to Laura was her attorney, Ethan Brooks, a black man in his 30s, who had been practicing for only a few years. Ethan wore a gray suit, but his hands shook slightly as he flipped through the documents. He glanced at Laura, whispering, "Are you okay?" Laura nodded, her voice small but firm. "I'm fine, Ethan. Just do your job." Judge Carter looked down from the chair, her voice stern. "Officer Harris, please come to the witness stand." Harris stood, adjusting his uniform with the confidence of a respected acquaintance. He stepped up to the stand, glancing at Laura with a look that said, "You don't stand a chance." As he was sworn in, he placed his hand on the Bible, his gaze unwavering. Laura watched him, taking in every detail, the way he leaned slightly, the way his fingers tapped the stand. She had analyzed such signs in interrogation rooms in the Middle East, and she knew what they meant. Harris began his testimony, his voice clear and convincing. He said that on a cold December night, he had received a call about a suspicious person near a liquor store on Marietta Street. When he arrived, he found Laura standing on the sidewalk, looking like she was loitering. When he asked her for her identification, Harris said, Laura became hostile, refusing to cooperate and pushing him when he tried to search her. "She was screaming at me and trying to reach for my gun," Harris said, his voice dropping for emphasis. "I had to handcuff her for her own safety." A murmur drifted through the courtroom. A reporter took notes, while an elderly woman in the back row shook her head, whispering to the person next to her, "That doesn't sound right." Judge Carter banged his gavel, calling for order. Laura sat still, her face expressionless, but inside she was a storm brewing. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about hundreds of others who had been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin, and she was ready to fight. Daniel Harris sat on the witness stand, his voice smooth as if he had rehearsed it dozens of times. He told his story with the confidence of someone who knew he was protected by the system. According to Harris, Laura Bennett not only refused to hand over her papers, but also raised her voice and pushed him so hard that he almost fell. He paused, put his hand on his shoulder as if still in pain, and continued. When I tried to restrain her, she swung her arms toward my gun. I had no choice but to handcuff her. The crowd in the courtroom stirred. Some nodded, believing Harris's story, especially when he insisted that he was only doing his duty to protect the community. But in the corner of the room, a group of people of color exchanged suspicious glances. A young man whispered, "Here we go again." Judge Evelyn Carter rapped her gavel, her gaze sharp but neutral. Laura sat motionless, her hands clasped on the table, her gaze focused on Harris. She recognized the way he glanced briefly at his two colleagues in the back row, the way his voice rose slightly when he spoke of the assault. To her, it was a sign of deception, masked by false confidence. Ethan Brooks, Laura's attorney, flipped through his notes, sweat beading on his forehead. "He's convincing them," he whispered. "Are you sure we can argue?" Laura turned to him, her gaze calm but firm. "Focus on the details, Ethan. He's lying and we'll prove it." Ethan nodded, though he was still nervous. The prosecutor, William Foster, a white man in his 50s in an expensive gray suit, rose. He stepped to the podium, asking leading questions to reinforce Harris's testimony. "Officer Harris, are you sure the defendant acted aggressively?" Foster asked, her voice thick with meaning. Harris nodded, her eyes never leaving the prosecutor. "Certainly, sir. I tried to avoid violence, but she was uncooperative." Foster smiled, turning to the jury. "No more questions, Your Honor." Harris returned to her seat, exchanging glances with her colleagues, one of whom nodded as if to confirm that everything was fine. But Laura knew better. She had spent her career analyzing opponents, and Harris was nothing more than a target to be neutralized. When Judge Carter called her name, Laura stood, moving with the confidence of someone who had faced far more dangerous situations. "Miss Bennett, please come to the stand," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. Laura nodded, her eyes locked on the judge. She knew this was the moment to begin turning the tables. Laura sat down on the witness stand, adjusting the microphone with slow movements. The courtroom fell silent, eyes on her. Foster stood, a small smile on her face. "Miss Bennett, would you like to explain your actions that night?" Laura looked at him, her voice calm but sharp. "I can, but first, I need to make it clear that Officer Harris's story was a deliberate lie." A murmur ran through the crowd. Foster raised his eyebrows, his tone becoming aggressive. "That's a serious charge. What evidence do you have?" Laura smiled slightly, her eyes unwavering. "The truth will speak for itself, sir. Just give it time." She began to recount the events, her voice clear and convincing. On the night of December 15th, Laura was walking home after having dinner with a friend at a restaurant on Marietta. She stopped near a liquor store to check her phone messages. Suddenly, a flashlight shined directly on her face, and Harris's voice rang out, coldly. "What are you doing here?" Laura replied that she was just looking at her phone, but when Harris asked for her papers, she asked, "What did I do that you need to check my papers?" The question enraged Harris. According to Laura, he raised his voice, grabbed her arm, and squeezed. "I asked him to let me go, but he pushed me into the patrol car," Laura said, her voice low but full of emotion. "He said, 'People like you are not allowed to ask questions.'" Murmurs filled the room, some in the audience shaking their heads in outrage. Judge Carter banged his gavel, calling for order. Laura sat on the stand, her hands resting lightly on the arms of her chair, her gaze scanning the courtroom. Prosecutor William Foster stepped forward, trying to regain control. Miss Bennett, are you asking us to believe that a veteran cop made this whole story up? He asked, his voice filled with doubt. Laura looked straight at him, her voice unwavering. I'm not asking the court to believe me. I'm asking the court to consider the facts. And the facts are, Officer Harris acted improperly. Foster sneered, but his eyes were unsettled. Do you have any evidence to back up these allegations? Laura tilted her head, her gaze sharp. His body camera, which should have recorded everything, failed at that moment. What a coincidence, don't you think? A murmur rippled through the crowd, and a few jurors raised their eyebrows. Harris, seated at the prosecution table, clenched his fists, his eyes averted. Laura continued, recounting the incident with the clarity of someone who had written intelligence reports. She described how Harris approached her without cause, how he became aggressive when she asked him questions, and how he pushed her into the patrol car when she tried to pull her hands away. I didn't resist, Laura said, her voice low but strong. I just asked why. And for that, he handcuffed me and accused me of assaulting him. I never touched him, and I certainly didn't try to grab his gun. She paused, letting the words sink in for the jury. His actions weren't about protecting the community. They were about policing, about punishing someone who dared to ask questions. Foster tried to interrupt, his voice sharp. You're accusing Officer Harris of discrimination? That's a serious charge, Ms. Bennett. Laura looked at him, her gaze unwavering. I'm not accusing. I'm telling you what he said. People like you are not allowed to ask questions. You can draw your own conclusions. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Several spectators stood, their faces filled with outrage. Judge Carter pounded her gavel repeatedly, her voice stern. Order, I will not tolerate interruptions. Foster opened his mouth to retort, but Laura's steady gaze made him hesitate. Judge Carter leaned forward, her voice low. Miss Bennett, do you have any other evidence to support your testimony? Ethan Brooks stood, his voice firmer than before. Your Honor, we will present additional evidence tomorrow. Foster sneered, his voice full of mockery. Delay, Your Honor. If they had something, they would have presented it. Laura looked straight at the judge, her voice firm. Your Honor, the truth will take time, but I promise it will come out. Judge Carter looked at her for a moment, then nodded. The court will adjourn until 9 a.m. tomorrow. As the gavel came down, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Laura stood, walking past Harris without looking at him. He bowed his head, his eyes worried. Ethan followed her, whispering, You did a good job, but tomorrow we need something bigger. Laura nodded, her eyes distant. Don't worry, Ethan. Tomorrow they'll see the truth. Outside the courthouse, dusk was settling over Atlanta. Laura stood on the steps, taking deep breaths of the cool air. She thought about the past months, the sleepless nights, the social media posts calling her a troublemaker, the messages of support from old friends in the military. She knew this case wasn't just about her. It was about hundreds of others who had been wronged by the system, and she was ready to fight. Laura stood on the porch of her house in the Atlanta suburb of Decatur that evening. Her small wooden house was nestled among oak trees, the streetlights casting long shadows on the driveway. Ethan Brooks drove up, looking nervous. He knocked on the door, and Laura opened it immediately, as if she had been waiting. She was wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans, her short curly hair loose. Come in, she said, her voice calm. Laura's living room was simple but cozy. A framed photo on the wall showed her in her Marine uniform, standing next to her team in Afghanistan. Books on military strategy, psychology, and a few detective novels lined the shelves. A folded American flag sat in a glass case on the coffee table. Ethan looked around, curious. "You live alone?" he asked. Laura nodded. "Yeah, since I left the military." She walked over to the bookshelf and pulled out a well-kept but well-worn file box. She placed it in front of Ethan, then sat down in the chair, across from him. "Here's my file," she said, her voice even. Ethan opened the box, his eyes widening as he flipped through the documents. Discharge papers, medals, intelligence training certificates. "Wait," he whispered, his voice aghast. "You're a Marine Corps intelligence major?" Laura nodded. "Major Laura Bennett, retired 2022. 15 years, working on intelligence operations in the Middle East and Africa." Ethan leaned back, rubbing his forehead. "Laura, this changes everything. Why didn't you say so sooner?" Laura leaned forward, her gaze serious. "Because this isn't just about me, Ethan. This is about people like Harris who think they can abuse their power with impunity. If I reveal it too soon, they'll turn my story into a TV show, not a wake-up call." Ethan nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "So what's the plan?" Laura stood up, walked to the window, and looked out into the night. "Tomorrow, we're not just going to prove my innocence. We're going to show the world that I've spent my life protecting this country, and no one should be allowed to take away my rights because of the color of my skin." Her voice was low but determined. "We're going to expose Harris, and in doing so, expose the system that keeps him." Ethan looked at her, feeling like he was standing before a true strategist. "Harris won't give up easily," he said. Laura smiled, her eyes glinting. "People like him dig their own graves. We just need to push." She turned back, placing her hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Prepare, Ethan. Tomorrow is a battle, and I know how to win." After Laura's testimony, the courtroom was filled with tension. Daniel Harris sat at the prosecution table, his face pale, his hands shaking. His colleagues in the back row looked at each other, their support now wavering. Judge Evelyn Carter called for both sides to prepare their closing arguments, her voice stern. "Choose your words carefully," she warned. William Foster stood up, trying to regain control. He stepped before the jury, his voice strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not simple. Officer Harris acted under pressure, trying to protect the community. Mistakes may have been made, but Miss Bennett challenged her authority, escalating the situation." He paused, his eyes scanning the jury, but no one responded. Foster sat down, his face full of worry. Ethan stood up, adjusting his suit with confidence. He stepped before the jury, his voice ringing out clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the story of a woman who was framed simply because she dared to ask a question. Major Laura Bennett, a hero who served this country, was treated like a criminal because of the color of her skin." He turned to Laura, his eyes filled with respect. "She did not fight. She stood up for her rights, and today, you have the opportunity to stand up for justice." Ethan held up Harris's file. "Officer Harris has a history of abusing his power, but the system protected him. Today we can say, enough is enough." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I trust you to do the right thing." Ethan returned to his seat, Laura nodding at him, her eyes full of pride. Judge Carter gave his final instructions, and the jury was ushered into the deliberations room. The hours of waiting seemed endless. After Laura's testimony, the courtroom was filled with tension. Daniel Harris sat at the prosecution table, his face pale, his hands shaking. His colleagues in the back row looked at each other, their support now wavering. Judge Evelyn Carter called for both sides to prepare their closing arguments, her voice stern. Choose your words carefully, she warned. William Foster stood up, trying to regain control. He stepped before the jury, his voice strained. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not simple. Officer Harris acted under pressure, trying to protect the community. Mistakes may have been made, but Miss Bennett challenged her authority, escalating the situation. He paused, his eyes scanning the jury, but no one responded. Foster sat down, his face full of worry. Ethan stood up, adjusting his suit with confidence. He stepped before the jury, his voice ringing out clearly. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the story of a woman who was framed simply because she dared to ask a question. Major Laura Bennett, a hero who served this country, was treated like a criminal because of the color of her skin. He turned to Laura, his eyes filled with respect. She did not fight. She stood up for her rights, and today, you have the opportunity to stand up for justice. Ethan held up Harris's file. Officer Harris has a history of abusing his power, but the system protected him. Today we can say, enough is enough. He paused, letting the words sink in. I trust you to do the right thing. Ethan returned to his seat, Laura nodding at him, her eyes full of pride. Judge Carter gave his final instructions, and the jury was ushered into the deliberations room. The hours of waiting seemed endless. Laura